So in chapter 16, we're going to look at the other half of the theories that we are going to potentially apply in a group counseling context. And so that will include existential, Gestalt, rational-emotive behavioral therapy, and the use of psychodrama. So for existential theory, as a refresher, the focus here is really on this idea of meaning and what it means to be human and making meaning out of the life experience. And so the key things here is that everyone has their own belief and value system, and so these things play out throughout the lifespan in our search for meaning and purpose in our life stressors and difficulties and experiences. And so the big focus, of course, is on this idea of greater meaning, but then also the idea of this paradox of living life fully, but also an awareness of death. And so this kind of dance and acceptance of I'm going to live my life, but also come to terms and acceptance of my own mortality and the limits of my lifespan and the things that I could potentially do in that space of my life. And so Frankl, of course, puts forth this idea that everyone has freedom to make their own choices, and then with that freedom comes the responsibility of what they do and the choices that they make. So because existential theory doesn't really have a lot of very specific techniques or interventions to go with it, it's just sort of this underlying philosophy and way of viewing life, existential groups really look more like a typical group context, very process-oriented, and really just incorporate some of these ideas of greater meaning into the dialogue and conversation and process of the group. And so in existential groups, there's this idea in applying this theory that people really make meaning through three different avenues: doing or accomplishing something, experiencing some kind of value, either through a conflict in that value or the ability to express that value or have understanding of that value, and then through some kind of suffering that helps you develop a deeper understanding of your greater meaning and develop this understanding and acceptance of your own mortality and death. And so, just like with individuals, there's this idea that dysfunction and struggle comes when people are not actively seeking meaning in life. And so, according to Frankl, there's this idea of choosing unhappiness as opposed to choosing to live your life in a way that seeks greater meaning. And so in a group, you would just focus on what all of these things look like in the group context. And so for existential groups, it's this idea that when you're in a group context, you get the perspective of others and you get challenged by others. And so there's this process of group members getting to realize their responsibility for making choices and how they're making their choices, and the ability to kind of change direction and focus more on a meaning-focused way of interacting with others. And so it's this idea of gaining awareness, connects a lot with that idea of therapeutic factors that Yalom talks about, where we get to really get a greater understanding of ourselves and greater perspective on how we interact with others, and then have the opportunity to shift focus to do that in a more meaningful way. And so in an existential group, you would hope that a client would be able to increase their self-awareness, to be able to take greater personal responsibility for their own life directions, to be able to get to a place where they're able to endure suffering and manage anxiety because they have this meaning and purpose behind their life that gives them comfort and the ability to do that, and to be able to live their life in a way that seeks greater meaning most of the time. And so as a group facilitator using existential theory, it's really important to know all of your group members. That rapport building process is critical, because you can't really expect to get into those deep spaces, and you can't really help the clients if you don't take the time to develop these close relationships and get to know them, so that you can have a better understanding of their values and their meaning in their life. And they're not going to share that with you unless they have that deep connection. You also would use some gentle confrontation and challenging to highlight where group members are saying that they want certain things or find certain value or purpose in things, but that really doesn't match up to the choices and decisions that they're making. Frankl talks about the importance of being transparent. And Yalom, who aligns a lot with Frankl's worldview, you see a lot of that in the book that we were reading for internship. And this idea of appropriate self-disclosure and using yourself as a source of knowledge through using reflection, using some interpretive skills, modeling ways of behaving and interacting with others that aligns with your values, being open about what your values are to a certain extent. It's very important because all of this conflict and confrontation comes up when people are growing and changing, that you're kind of the calm in the storm, that you're able to keep your cool and really be able to navigate the group from a place that's very stable and centered. And so in that way, you're kind of the anchor that holds down the whole process for the group members. And be willing to go to a place where you're discussing meaning and value and very deep-rooted things that make people who they are and how those have played out in their different life experiences and the suffering and the obstacles that they've faced along the way. And so as a result of using the existential theory in a group context, our hope is that group members will gain awareness. They'll be able to kind of evaluate their decision-making process and move it to a place that's a more meaning-focused and purpose-focused way of living. That they'll become more connected to their own feelings and willing to sit in places of suffering because it's to suit and pursue that greater purpose, and find motivation and strength through suffering instead of finding it as a defeating experience. To, of course, find new meaning and become authentic and genuine in living life according to that meaning, and to ultimately then have a greater interpersonal responsibility for demonstrating that meaning in your interaction with others. So now we'll shift and examine Gestalt theory as applied to groups. So in Gestalt theory, there are 4 kind of basic assumptions to the theory in general. So there's this idea of integration. And so we all have this unfinished business. We all have these different fragmented pieces of ourselves. And so in order to become fulfilled, we have to integrate these different pieces of ourselves into one whole and complete and congruent person. And so the way that we do that is to become self-aware and to learn more about ourselves and to be able to know who we are so that we can be more congruent and fit these pieces back together. Because in our lives, we have what's called figure and ground. So these kind of essential and important pieces of our lives that require a lot of attention, and then these kind of background pieces that are not as important but can be very draining and also require our attention. And so it's an idea of, at any given time, we are making decisions about what to focus on and where our energy is best spent. And sometimes we aren't necessarily doing that in the best or most healthy way because of those unfinished business pieces that we have carrying around with us. And so we essentially need to, in order to become fulfilled as people and to meet our needs, we have to stop operating at different ends of a spectrum, like polar ends of a spectrum, and come to a place where we're more integrated and balanced in the middle. And so what that looks like is that groups offer this multi-dimensional space, and individuals together in a group represent different types of polarities and different levels of awareness and have different needs of integration. Some individuals are experiencing more holism than others. And so because you have this group of people that are all in different spaces at different times, they can help each other along this process. So what this looks like in a group context is, and there's kind of 2 different approaches or schools of thought about this. There's where there's a focus on just one person at a time, versus a focus on a more interactive and here and now focused group, similar to what Yalom talks about. And so the more modern approach is really this balance between the 2, where you get to focus on an individual if they kind of need a little bit more support in that week, but also there's a lot of interaction and process and linking and sharing and connecting with each other so that you can learn from others' perspectives and not just your own. And so some examples of this this is called kind of a dual-focused Gestalt group work process. So it combines that West Coast process of there being a focus on one individual for a while and then shifting to someone else, and this East Coast style, which is more interactive and here and now, and kind of a faster moving process in terms of sharing. And so an example of this is this idea of the floating hot seat, where someone would be sharing about something in their life, and if it triggers or touches something in mine, it would be my turn to immediately speak up and connect with that individual through something that looks like linking, and to then share about my own experience, which might trigger something in someone else to share as well. And so in that way, we're constantly moving from person to person, and the participants are really active in the way that they're sharing and processing, as opposed to a facilitator who's really just focused on one person at a time. And so leadership looks like a lot of here and now focus. So even in discussing things that have happened in the past, it's really important to keep it in the present, in the here and now of the group context. We want to help group members locate impasses where they're stuck and unable to navigate because of the polarity issues, or figure ground issues, or because they're not integrative enough. And so helping build that awareness so that individuals can grow to a space where they are more whole and integrated, and that allows them to navigate potential impasses in a different way that they were not before and resulted in them becoming stuck. You'll also want to really focus on growth. And so the point of Gestalt in groups is not to blame, or to take on different kinds of roles like being a victim, but to focus on growth and focus on ways that you can make changes in your life that allow you to become more integrated. And so group members might be asked to work on a specific problem. You might focus on one specific piece of themselves or issue in their life, or piece of unfinished business that they might have brought up, so that they can be very focused in their work to gain that awareness. And so some different examples of things that you might use, because Gestalt is a very behavioral focused process, is experiments, where you get to kind of play out in the group what might have happened if things went differently in a certain situation, or exercises to try new things. And you'll see when we talk about psychodrama how that evolved out of this Gestalt idea, because these experiments and exercises include some reenactment that looks a lot like what psychodrama looks like, just on a smaller scale. Some directed behavior. So I would like for you to try this week to interact in this different sort of way, and then let us know how it goes. This idea of fantasy. So if you could have everything work out the way that you want it to, what would that look like? What would you want to do? Kind of the same with dreams. And then homework. So practicing things outside of the group context, because it's really important for people to be proactive and to exercise and practice these things outside of group, because the dysfunction and problems are likely happening outside of group and not in the group. And so the most useful thing for someone to do is to practice those outside of the group context as well. Some different examples of exercises that you are likely familiar with from Gestalt theory in general is making the rounds. So everybody, kind of like that hot seat idea where everybody's contributing. This idea of rehearsal. So you want to confront your friend this week. Let's try it in group and see how it might go. This idea of role reversal. So what would it be like if you were your parent or your teacher or whomever in that situation? How do you think you would react? What are you feeling in that seat of power or situation of power? Paying attention to body language, because of this idea of holism. Every piece of ourselves is reflective of this inner process, and so you want to pay a lot of attention to body language. And then this idea of, instead of asking questions, making statements. And so it's this idea of growing that self-awareness instead of self-doubt. We use empty chair in group just as much. Along with that top dog, underdog dialogue, so examining power differentials and relationships and how those things might change. We talked a little bit about fantasy. Gestalt does get into some ideas around dreams. And then we talked a little bit also about homework. And so in Gestalt, the counselor takes on a bit more of an expert role. So you might be a little bit more interpretive. You are constantly making observations about things that you're noticing as the seer. You are probably directing clients around different things that they could try or different ways they could communicate differently or more effectively. You're deliberately creating frustration because you want to bring that into the here and now so that it can be processed and worked through in the moment. You're also, through using some of these exercises and experiments, creating opportunities for individuals to have different kinds of experiences, and then likely introducing some kind of skill development piece as the teacher. So you're navigating all of these different types of roles, and it's a balance to be able to give the group what they need in the moment while things are kind of moving along pretty quickly. And so our goal and our hope in all of this is that group members would gain self-awareness, be able to understand, reflect, and recognize what's going on for them in the moment, in the here and now, not just in the group context, but outside. And then in having that awareness of what's going on with them in their body, in their reactions in the moment, be able to make some changes in their life that result in them being able to interact with people differently. And so you're working towards that integration piece, you're shedding neuroses, you're finding satisfaction in unfinished business that you have in your past and getting rid of that emotional debris that is potentially impacting your relationships now. And so you're able to grow and come to a space where you're able to navigate conflict in different situations in your lives in a way that's more productive and useful and less reactive and potentially based on events from your past and not necessarily things that are going on now. And so when leaving the group, clients should be more congruent. They should have greater understanding of their personal and interpersonal selves, their interactions with others, and are less likely to have emotional reactions or to make decisions based on the past, but instead focus on the present and their goals for the future. So next we're going to talk about Rational-Emotive Behavioral Therapy, or REBT. So Rational-Emotive Behavioral Therapy, REBT, developed by Ellis. So just as a refresher, the basic ideas behind REBT are that any kind of struggle or dysfunction we experience in our life is really rooted in this negative or irrational thought process that's driving our behavior. And so this idea of self-talk, and if we're having any kind of difficulties or experiencing any kind of distress, it's because we're having this negative self-talk that's influencing our view of ourselves, and these irrational thoughts and beliefs are really impacting how we view ourselves, how we interact with the world, and how we determine our behavior. And so if we learn to control those thoughts and behaviors, then our overall life circumstances will improve. And so the REBT model is really based on this ABC idea, where there's this event that triggers something inside of you. Your thought process starts about the event that triggered your reaction. You have potentially these irrational thoughts and beliefs that are creating this negative thought pattern, and those thoughts then trigger certain types of feelings that impact your overall ability to function in your life process. And so according to the REBT model, there are different types of thoughts. There's negative thoughts, positive thoughts, neutral thoughts, and then mixed. And so the kind of the basic premise here is that we all have sort of this dual nature. There's two sides of us, almost like a yin and a yang. And so we have this rational piece of ourselves that's very logical and is not in a reactive and emotional space. And then there's these irrational beliefs, which are ones that sort of contort and warp what really happens to create this very emotionally reactive space. And so when we're working out of this irrational belief side of ourselves, we're going to experience dysfunction and potentially some types of mental illness, anxiety, depression, according to this theory, are triggered by this irrational belief space. And so when we're able to move into that more rational belief space, we become less emotionally reactive and experience healthy and productive lifespan experiences. And so the process of therapy, according to this model, is really this process of examining and then disputing these irrational thoughts that are coming from this sort of irrational belief space within ourselves. And so the goal of the theory overall is to become a more rational thinker, which makes you less emotionally reactive to environmental triggers. And that way you're able to spend more time in rational and positive thought processes instead of negative and emotionally reactive thought processes. And that helps you become more productive in your life. And so part of that is to get to the space where you're no longer labeling yourself and others, and you're able to really rationally evaluate what's going on and then to make a decision about what should come next for you. And what this looks like in groups is really this balance of building skills for coping and this kind of broader conversation and exploration about your belief systems. And so really the group context is there for accountability purposes. So the process therapeutically really looks similar to individual counseling. You're just in a group and have other people that you're accountable to and sharing with. And so it's this idea that group members come into group, they share stressful experiences that are causing them some kind of dysfunction or distress or emotional reaction. The group leader helps them apply this ABC model to identify the triggering event, to connect with the deeper belief system, and then the emotions that came from that cognitive process. And then there's feedback exchange from both the group leader and the group members, because in the REBT model, the group leader is a very active participant in this whole process. And so that feedback is really built and purposed to dispute irrational thoughts about whatever event it is that came up that week that this person is experiencing as distressing. And so in this exchange of feedback, there's feedback questioning and challenging those negative thought processes to get at those irrational belief systems. There's this imaginative dispute. So this idea where you're able to try and modify that self-talk by asking, what if this happened? What if you did this? It's introducing new possibilities, and the idea is that then the individual would have a wider array of choices in terms of reaction to that event. And then behavior. So homework is a really big part of this REBT process, and you might come back to group and then share and report about how your homework went. So it's this idea that challenging irrational thoughts cannot just happen in the therapeutic space, because the actual irrational thoughts are coming up in your everyday environment. And so for this process to work, you can't just do it in the therapy space, you have to do it in your everyday environment as well. And so there's a lot of homework that involves you applying the skills that you develop in the group context to life outside of the group. So in terms of leadership in REBT groups, you first have to really kind of frame and introduce the REBT model, because you can't really use the ABC model to process life events if the group members don't understand and are not on board with the ABC model to begin with. And so it's important to start with teaching the ABC model. There's a lot of teaching of skills that can be used to combat those negative thought processes and to better manage emotional reactions. And then there's giving feedback to group members in how to apply this ABC model to different situations that they are experiencing. And so our hope is that in doing all of this, group members would learn to work from a more rational thought process space and be able to better cope with environmental stressors and triggers and adversity.
And finally, in this chapter, we are going to discuss transactional analysis.
So in talking about transactional analysis, and this is the only theory that will really get into the nitty-gritty of the theory, because I'm not sure how much of a foundation that you all might have in transactional analysis, and it's a theory that's not necessarily widely used with individuals, but is something that comes up quite a bit in groups. And so you see transactional analysis reflecting some of the work of Freud and some of the earlier understandings of counseling and therapy. And so transactional analysis is really well oriented to use with groups. And it's really this process of examining interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics that go on in groups and using those to understand ego process and patterns of behavior that come out for individuals that they may not be aware of. And so this in groups using TA, learning happens through the interactions and participation in the group experience. And the facilitator's role is to really highlight these different patterns and to help bring awareness to these things. Because like Freud's early work, there's this idea that we start developing these pieces of ourselves early in childhood, and we have these different egos, the parent, adult, and child. And so parent being kind of that overruling, nurturing but critical decision-making kind of space where you're judging a bit. The adult being this kind of like a processing, very analytical aspect of the self. And then the child state, which is really trying to break free of boundaries and more spontaneous and perhaps a little more prone to making actions without thinking or being impulsive. And so you can see how those are somewhat reflective of Freud's early ego work, as well as this was kind of a development out of that. And so each of us have these 3 different ego states, and these ego states take over our interactions with others and influence the way that we interact with others and make decisions. And we may not always be aware of that. And so in transactional analysis, during the group experience, we are learning what types of ego states individuals are in at different aspects of interacting with others, and how those ego states may be influencing their behavior. And so really where those ego states come out more than anything else is in interactions with each other and with other people. And so in the group, there's this focus on dynamics, but there's more of a focus on dynamics as almost a diagnostic tool, and focus more on the individual and understanding their ego states and how they're interacting and interpreting the worlds. And so how we do that is different kind of basic ways that we identify ego state. So there's a lot of emphasis on behavior, so decision making, how we interact with others, choices that we're making, our social state, which is who we have around us and how we're connecting with those people, historical, so looking at how we've made decisions or past patterns that we have from childhood growing into adulthood, and then this idea of phenomenological, so different things that might just happen throughout our lives that at the time seem random but are actually indicative of deeper processes that are going on. And so our interactions with others are driven by our current ego state. And so in transactional analysis, we see that all our interactions with others are serving this different purpose. And this theory describes those as strokes. And so the strokes are really this idea of seeking different physical or psychological recognition or reward from our interactions with others. And so the way that we interact with others is serving this other purpose. It's not genuine or sincere. It's driven by these ego states and this need. And so the way that we interact with others might include withdrawal or certain types of patterns or rituals or certain kind of games or connection with others. And all of these, according to transactional analysis, is this way of seeking satisfaction of the ego state that you are in. And so then we have these scripts, which are patterns of behavior and how people spend their time, and these roles that we tend to fall into when we're in social interactions with others. And so in these transactions, we are seeking that recognition. We're seeking those strokes. And so essentially in transactional analysis, the way that we spend our time and the way that we interact with others and all of the choices that we make are not really sincere and not really choices, but just reflections of our ego state and what we need based on the ego state that we are in. And so you can imagine why transactional analysis works so well in a group setting, because when you're in a therapeutic group setting, you have this safe and supported space to start to examine these interactions with others. You can start identifying those scripts. And so in that, you can gain a lot of awareness of yourself and how you react to others and provide insight to others about their scripts and the way that they're interacting with others. And the ultimate goal of all of this is so that individuals can learn about their ego states and then in some way find satisfaction in those ego states so they can be in more control of their own process and their life. And so transactional analysis in groups talks about different kinds of contracts. So this idea of therapeutic contracts, which are focused on the client and these goal statements that individuals make in what they want to accomplish as part of the group. We have classic contracts, which are different kinds of therapeutic decisions that are made by the therapist. And so these are the different interventions that you would use. So structural analysis, meaning that you are examining each member of the group to determine their ego states and how those ego states are influencing their functioning. You have transactional analysis, which is examining the interactions between group members. And the purpose of that is to diagnose those scripts that might be going on. You have game analysis. And so that's, again, looking at behavioral patterns and interactions between group members to determine what kinds of needs they're trying to fulfill in those interactions. And then this life script analysis, which is really more focused on the individual than the group. And so it may not be something that actively takes place in the group, but maybe something that's sort of a result of the group where an individual gets to examine their script across their lifespan and determine how their ego states and those scripts have influenced their life trajectory, their decision-making process, potentially any kind of interpersonal issues or struggles they've had that have brought them to group in the first place. And then in doing that, they get to examine what they'd like to do in the future and how they can be working within those different ego states to be able to fulfill those needs and goals for the future. And then we have these redecision contracts. So that's the latter part of that process, where each individual gets the opportunity to look at how these ego states have been influencing them and then getting to take some more control out of the direction in their life by setting new goals.